He was a morbidly obese surgeon destined for an operating table and an early death. Now he's a rebel MD who is fabulously fit and fighting to make America healthy again. This is Stay Off My Operating Table with Dr. Philip Ovadia.
Hey folks, it's Stay Off My Operating Table with Dr. Philip Ovadia, and we've got something. I know I say this all the time, Phil, something a little different, but this is different. Our guest today is somebody about whom I have tried to find information and failed. Now, usually I like to read up on our guests and kind of have an idea where they come from and what they're about and maybe why they're here. And the only thing I've been able to find out about this guy is A, he barely has any social media presence at all, and B, he's an ER nurse. That's it. So tell us, why did you invite Darius Sharpe to be on the show? And then we'll get into whatever he's here to talk about.
Yeah, well, I would put Darius in the category of one of the people that I am just fortunate to have come to know. And he's not really out there necessarily as a public figure, but I can guarantee you this is going to be a very interesting conversation. He's one of those just deep thinkers, and I think has some unique perspectives to bring to the metabolic health space. He does occasionally come out of the shadows. He had a recent talk at Dave Feldman's COSI conference that we're going to talk about. And I think it also spoken at COSI maybe a year or two ago as well. But like I said, I'm just consider myself fortunate to have gotten to know Darius over the past couple of years, and wanted to bring his story and his, like I said, some interesting perspectives that he's developed on metabolic health out to the world. So with that, Darius, why don't you introduce yourself, talk a little bit about what got you interested in metabolic health, talk a little bit about what you do within healthcare. We mentioned already that you are a nurse in the emergency room, and then we'll go from there.
All right. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Jack. I don't like talking about myself much, but I am, like you said, in the shadows, really. I don't have much of a social media presence. I actually got into this whole space because I ended up on Dave Feldman's Lean Mass Hyperresponder Facebook group after I saw that my LDL was quite high. And I also had the low triglycerides and high HDL. I was like, oh, I fit this thing. And I had kind of started dabbling in the space and, watching some YouTube videos and finding Dave's blog online, The Cholesterol Code. And I was like, oh, well, let me check this out. And I joined the Facebook group and have been on that since 2019. So Dave Feldman actually knows me mostly from that because I posted a ton. I've done a ton of personal experiments and done a boatload of lab tests like he has. Actually, for his Own Your Labs company that he owns, I am the most frequent user, according to him.
Huh.
Yeah.
So do you get frequent flyer points there?
I really wish, not so much, but you know what? I'm very happy to support that business. As for me, my background, I started out in actually working on an ambulance, 911. I was an EMT, started at age 18, worked for a few years, became a paramedic at age 21, worked as a paramedic for 13 years, and then became a nurse. Now I've been an ER nurse for 8 years. I'm 42. Always been very fit, healthy, and active. So I never really had any health issues for myself, but I did notice very early on in my career, like the same things over and over again with all the patients that I saw. So on the ambulance, I remember asking this, again, I was probably 19. And I remember asking this with my paramedic partners. I'm like, why don't we prescribe like diets to patients? Like I see the same exact things over and over. I see they're all obese. They all have heart disease. They all have diabetes. They're on all of the same medications. You can practically copy and paste the medication list. Metformin, lisinopril, losartan, Lipitor. You can just rattle them off. It's all the same medications. Hydrochlorothiazide. They're all taking the same things. They all have the same problems. I'm like, well, why don't we fix the problems rather than medicate these people? Of course, I never got a good answer on that one. But the further I've gone in my career, the more apparent that it's all the same stuff affecting people, and they're all coming in, they're all calling 911 for the ultimate resulting problems of the illness that they've accumulated over the years.
Yeah.
My own personal medical history, I've always been fit. I've never been overweight. I've always exercised. I ran track in high school. I have had a gym membership since I was 18. But I do have not the best family history. All of my biological grandparents were dead by the time I was 21. My grandma on my maternal side died of an MI at 62, just dropped dead Christmas morning. My grandpa on that side died in his, I think, early 70s. My grandparents on my biological dad's side died when they were, I think, in their mid 70s. They all had strokes and heart attacks, and all of them had every single one of them had diabetes. Actually, my grandma on my mom's side had type 1. So I've always thought to myself, okay, I need to pay attention to my health because I don't have the best genetics, and I need to make sure that I'm always lean and fit and active. Early on, that just meant, hey, don't eat too much and make sure you're exercising. So I didn't really pay attention to carbs or anything like that. I had the benefit of, remember, I started working at age 18 as an EMT. Most people I work with were in their mid 20s. So I had the benefit of watching them over the few years I worked with them. And you hit that like mid to late 20s and you just start putting on the pounds. And I remember seeing that and going, holy crap, I need to control my eating. Because back then I was like, I would get the extra large Jamba Juice and a burrito and just pound those down. You could just eat as many calories as you want at that age. And I remember thinking, you know what? That's going to catch up to me. I better pare back my eating at this point. And so that's kind of what I did. Again, I managed to always stay lean and fit. But later on, after I started nursing school, actually I had a couple interesting things happen to me. When I was in nursing school, we had our day that we learned how to use glucometer, which is kind of funny because I've been using it for years. But we had to check our own blood sugar. Everybody around the table did, and I didn't do this on myself. I did it a couple times in the ambulance just for fun, and it was always like in the 80s. But this time I checked it, and it was about an hour and a half after I had the smoothie that I made every single morning before school. And everybody around the table was like in the
Healthy
80s and 90s.
smoothie, I'm guessing, right?
But actually, yeah, it was frozen strawberries, frozen blueberries, frozen bananas, whole milk, peanut butter, and protein powder.
Yep.
I didn't add any sugar to it. I didn't even add any juice. But when I checked my blood sugar, it was 126. And everybody else,
Put that in context for those of us who are not medical professionals.
yeah, it's so normally blood sugar should sit in between 70 and 100 milligrams per deciliter if you're fasted. Ideally, you would consume something and your blood sugar would go up, and by the 2 hour mark, be back down into that normal range after eating. In my case, this is about an hour and a half, almost 2 hours from consuming that smoothie, and I was still sitting at 126, which is much higher than I would like it to be. The definitions of hyperglycemia kind of vary depending on which source you look at. I think universally over 140 is definitely considered hyperglycemia. Over 125 for some people, they say that's actually hyperglycemia. But safe to say, my glucose was elevated, and especially in the context of looking around the table at everybody else, and theirs were in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So when I saw that, I was like, huh, that's interesting. I kept going through nursing school. I just plowed my way through, didn't think much about the whole health aspect. Prior to that, I was good about like trying to eat more whole foods at home, generally cutting down on sugar at home. But I didn't pay attention to like macros. I didn't pay attention to carbohydrates versus fats. I always made sure I ate plenty of protein because I was big into like, lifting weights and working out. By the time I ended nursing school, I had put on a couple of pounds because the very last semester I was stressed out. I was working 2 jobs. I actually had just ended a long-term relationship. And I remember going to Costco and buying the 5 pound bucket of Toll House chocolate chip cookie dough
Oh
and
my God.
eating that over about 3 weeks.
Oh dear Lord.
Yes, I know.
That's deep depression there.
But it was delicious depression.
Delicious depression. Okay.
But
This is not medical advice, people.
yes, don't do this. So by the time I finished that semester, I remember I was about 192, which for me was as big as I'd ever been. Nobody would look at me and think I was fat though. I was still very muscular, still working out. But I definitely knew I'd gain a little more weight than I wanted to. I tend to be better off like in the 175 to 180 range. So once I finally had some kind of more bandwidth to look at other things, this is at the end of 2017. Someone had recommended Max Lugavere's book, Genius Foods. And so that was actually my first, you might not know this one, but
I don't.
that was actually my first step into the world of like low carb, ketogenic, whole food type eating. Again, prior to this, I had pared down like added sugars and gotten rid of like added artificial colors and flavors at home. I'd already kind of been doing that over the years, but this is the first book that really kind of introduced the idea of just whole foods, keep your carbohydrates and your glycemic carbs low. And so I started following that. And again, it was kind of like a not necessarily ketogenic diet, but definitely low carb, probably in the 50 to 100 grams carbs range net. And I dropped the weight. I dropped 20 pounds in like, heck, 2 months. Just weight just fell off. I was like, oh, well, this is good. So
How old
I,
were you? How old were you at that time?
so I would have been probably
Late
about
20s?
35,
Oh, mid
35 at the
30s.
time. So I'm 42.
Okay.
That was, yeah, right about that time. I was 35. So I had continued eating that way. I had practiced some fasting and I was feeling pretty good. Well, I was still, even though I was eating better at home, I was still very liberal with myself when I went out. And I would still have some soda and some bread and pasta, whatever. Because again, I lost the weight and I was feeling good and fit. Well, about a year after that, so this would have been like January of 2018, I believe. Yeah. 20, no, actually, January of 2019. I had decided I got off a shift. I worked 12 hours. I got off shift at 11 p.m. and my commute home was an hour. So I was like, I have a hankering for some In-N-Out burger, which anybody from California is very familiar with. So I decided, what? I'm going full bore. I'm getting the root beer. I'm getting the burger with the bun. I'm getting fries and ketchup. Meanwhile, this is like this meal I'm describing to you is ubiquitous in America, right?
Oh yeah.
Everybody eats this all the time. Well, I got off work, went over to the restaurant, got it from the drive-through, sat in the parking lot, ate it, started my drive home. 10 minutes in, I'm feeling like garbage, and I'm like, man, I feel awful right now. I'm like, I wonder what my blood sugar is. And at this point, I'd already bought a glucometer. So I get home. It's exactly an hour later. I've been sitting in a car the whole time, right? So this is a perfect like 1 hour postprandial glucose check. Well, when I check my glucose, it comes back at 253, which is very high.
Yep.
And
You
if you
essentially
actually,
just diagnosed yourself with diabetes.
yes, when I looked at it, I was like, holy crap. I mean, if a patient walks into my ER and their glucose is in the 250s, I'd be like, what the heck did you eat before you walked in here? You're diabetic, you're not taking care of yourself. What are you doing? But I was like, wow, this is me we're talking about. And that number blew my mind. But it also really piqued my interest. I'm like, well, what happens if I reduce the carbohydrates? And would you actually permit me to share my screen?
Sure. Hang on just a sec.
All right. So if you can see that, so it was actually 251 was the glucose.
Wow.
So it actually
Let's
really
do,
piqued my
for the folks who are listening, I'm going to just, why don't you describe what your four different images are here, as well as showing them?
yeah. So on the upper left there, that was actually the initial reading. It was 251 was the number. Again, extremely high for someone who's not diabetic, who is fit and active. I was like, well, what happens if I reduce the carbohydrates in this meal? So the obvious one I got rid of first was the root beer, just had water. So if you look in the upper right, I had the In-N-Out burger, had two hamburger patties on it with the bun, fries and ketchup, but I had water that time. Checked my glucose 1 hour later. I did this like, it took like a month. I was like, let me do this experiment. I got off work at the exact
This is
same time.
January 23rd, and the next one is March 2nd.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
I
Okay.
decided to do that. At first I was like, holy crap, I'm going to stay away from this food. And so a month, went by, and I thought, this is kind of interesting. What happens if I reduce the carbohydrates? And so got rid of the soda. This is my very first like experiment that I ever did on myself.
Right.
I got rid of the soda and I got home. Sugar was 204, still very high. I was like, okay, well, I still don't like that. Well, let me get rid of the bun. I'll just do a lettuce wrap burger. So I did lettuce wrap burger, two patties, fries with ketchup and water. I get home, glucose is 142. Definitely a lot better, but still higher than I would like. By this time, I'm like, okay, I'm actually reducing the amount of calories. I still need to feel like I'm satiated. So I had two burgers, two patties each, but both of them were lettuce wrapped. I didn't have any fries. I just had water. Got
Yep.
home and glucose was 113 post meal. And I'm like, that's the range where I need to be. And it really, really opened my eyes to the idea that, wow, at least for me, this is the way I should be eating. Because if there is one thing that is ubiquitous with the sick patients I see in the ER, it is that number on the upper left there. Actually, those two numbers on the top, high glucose, hyperglycemia. I see it all the time. And the worse your glucose is, the sicker you are as a patient.
Phil, jump in here real
Yep.
quick and comment because Darius ran some experiments on himself and then did a little pattern recognition with the patients he sees in extreme circumstances in an emergency room. When you're looking at patients, they've obviously got a serious condition, but at that point it's chronic. It's not necessarily acute. A comment on what Darius just showed us.
Yeah, well, so the first thing I'll do is give a shout out to Darius, right? Because I got to tell you, I was a EMT, when I was in college at that same age, right? And I was one of Darius's partners, right? Who he was watching getting fatter and fatter because, we just, you eat a lot of fast food, you're working overnight shifts, all of that stuff, right? Very unhealthy lifestyle. And then, quite frankly, I went through, college, medical school, early part of my career, right? And I saw the same things that Darius is describing, as a heart surgeon, right? Every patient literally on my table, same deal. And it took me quite a while to wake up to this, right? And as people know from my story, it really took, when I kind of looked in the mirror, all of a sudden, I'm like, you're pre-diabetic, you're morbidly obese, you're going to be on the table. And, I started coming across low carb and of course, that's what woke me up to this. Now that I know, yes, I see it. Every one of my patients without fail that ends up on my table for, atherosclerotic heart disease, they are all insulin resistant if we look for it the right way. Most of them spike their blood sugars, right? A lot of them will come and, they'll say, well, I'm not diabetic. Right. But after the operation, they're in the ICU and their blood sugars are 250. Right. And we're pumping insulin into them to get their blood sugar back down. And, it isn't that unusual that patients discover that they are diabetic when they're, in the hospital for their heart attack and their subsequent heart surgery. Like that's the first time that it's been revealed to them. But they've been diabetic for a long time. Now, what's interesting about Darius, right? That blood sugar of 250, right? If you have a postprandial blood sugar of 250, you're diagnosed as diabetic, right? But Darius isn't diabetic. Like Darius said, he's in good shape. He's pretty muscular. I don't know if you know what your A1C was at that time, Darius, but I know what it is now, right? And you're not diabetic. Yet, one of the things you've been kind of talking about is you still, if you eat these carbohydrates, you get very high blood sugars. And that kind of brings us to, an interesting conversation about, we talk a lot about insulin resistance and how important it is not to be insulin resistant. But even if you're not overtly insulin resistant, there may still be some trouble brewing under the hood.
Okay.
Exactly. I spoke recently at the collaborative science conference that Dave Feldman put on in Vegas, and my talk actually was about the specific thing is postprandial hyperglycemia. Now, most people
Oh, you know
think
what? I just realized prandial, postprandial.
after
That's
eating.
that's that's something that
After you eat.
yeah,
Yep.
after eating. Thank you.
Yes. Sorry, I throw around terms like a lot of times that I forget that people often don't know what I'm talking about. So please feel free to stop me or just even for the listeners.
Oh, I never hesitate to do that.
Yes. Thank you. My talk was specifically on this idea of acutely high glucose, even if it is not chronically high, is damaging in all kinds of different ways. Chiefly among them is it increases oxidative stress enormously. It also causes acute clotting. Like we can actually measure elevated D-dimer and elevated prothrombin fragments, which is actually literally clotting in the blood happening in the moment the moment you are hyperglycemic. There's
Whoa,
all,
whoa, whoa. Did I hear that right? You can detect the blood being more prone to clot?
not just more prone to clotting, actual clotting. So we have
The moment the blood sugar tips over into that danger zone.
into that hyperglycemic range. Now, where that exactly happens is not entirely clear. So in the studies, they usually are looking at glucose over 180 in the 200 range, but obviously I'm hitting that easily. And anybody who's diabetic and anybody who's pre-diabetic can easily hit that if they're consuming like really rapidly absorbed hyperglycemic carbohydrates. It's tiny clotting, right? It's not necessarily a big giant clot, but it definitely increases your likelihood of having a larger clot. I cannot tell you how many times, especially stroke patients come in and they are acutely hyperglycemic. Their glucose is in the 200, 300, 400s very, very frequently. Now, can I say for sure that they ate something and they had a giant glucose spike and therefore the stroke happened? No, I can't say that. But there's all these things that point in the same direction, right? Diabetes is the single biggest risk factor, bar none, for heart disease and for cardiovascular disease, for cardiovascular events. And the funny, the number 2 and 3 are what's called lipoprotein insulin resistance score and the metabolic syndrome. Now, the thing that I see, and Phil talks about as well, the most common things that I see in these sick patients, these acutely sick patients, is they almost universally have metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome, for those people who don't know, is a kind of a constellation of factors. We look at what's called central obesity. So it's actually a measurement of your waist circumference over, I believe it's over 35 inches for men and over 40 inches for women. Correct me if I'm wrong,
Yep.
Phil.
Yep, that's correct. 40
And
inches for men, 35 inches for women. Yeah.
that's right. That's right. And then hypertension, elevated blood glucose. So it's a fasting glucose of over 100 or an A1C in the pre-diabetic range. High triglycerides. So that's the technical cutoff, I believe, is 140 milligrams per deciliter. And HDL, low HDL. And for women, I think it's under 40 for women, under 50 for men. Again, correct
Flipped
me if I'm
again.
wrong.
Yeah. Under
Flipped
50
again.
for women, under 40 for men. Yeah. And 150 on the triglycerides.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, in general, and those numbers are always a little fudgy because there's always a room for error in the lab value that you get. So if you get a man whose HDL is 42, they're still like that's still way too low. In general, when you have metabolic syndrome, you are insulin resistant. So again, it would coincide with or be congruent with the LPIR score. So if you have metabolic syndrome, you would see a high lipoprotein insulin resistance score in these people. Anybody who has insulin resistance if they're consuming glycemic carbs, they're having large glucose spikes. Like it's just happening. You slap a CGM on them and you'll see it happen. And I'm fortunately now seeing lots of patients come in, diabetic patients at least, who have CGMs. And it's fascinating to look at them because I'll have them show it to me. I'm like, hey, let me see your data. And sadly, a lot of them never actually look at it until I point it out to them. And the interesting thing is you'll see their glucose actually kind of hangs around in the, maybe high 90s, low 100s, maybe one teens. That's their baseline. But when they eat, not even a lot of food, like just a little bit of toast, their glucose will shoot into the 300 range. It'll eventually come back down, and area under the curve matters, but that acute spike causes tons of oxidative stress, again, causes acute clotting. It causes, and a big thing it causes is LDL glycation and oxidation. It causes a decrease in what's called flow-mediated dilation. That's the ability of your arteries to expand to increase blood flow or increase demand. So in other words, your arteries are stiffer. They're not expanding like they should, and which leads to higher blood pressure. And we know high blood pressure leads to all kinds of other problems, right? And this, again, all this happens acutely within the first hour or two of glucose being elevated. And things like the prothrombin fragments and the D-dimer, those stay elevated for 24 hours after the exposure.
I just want to highlight something that Darius said there that may have been a little lost because he was using the technical terms, but he mentioned LDL glycation and oxidation, right? And what that means is that those cholesterol particles, that everyone's always worried about, the LDL cholesterol, they're getting damaged by the blood sugar, right? And this is one of the important things of understanding, again, a lot of what I talk about, why high cholesterol may be problematic in some situations and may not be problematic in other situations. And it also points to the fact that even if you have what's considered to be a normal or a low cholesterol level, LDL cholesterol level, you still might be causing problems if you have sugar constantly damaging those particles, because that's really what you see when you look at the plaque. It's not the normal healthy LDL particles. It's these damaged, oxidized, glycated LDL particles that are involved in the plaque forming.
This is subtle but important. Okay.
So one of the things that I talked about in my talk at COSI was about the fact that LDL, when you look at population studies, it associates with heart disease, right? The higher LDL is, the more likely you have cardiovascular disease. But it's like a weak association. It's consistent, it's always there, but it doesn't have the hazard ratio that, say, like diabetes or metabolic syndrome do, or hypertension for that matter. I think the reason this is, and this is just my harebrained theory, is that when you look at the population, at least the US adult population, 60% of US adults are diabetic or pre-diabetic. And when you look at the current CGM studies that they started doing, there's another 10% of the adult population that is not either diabetic or pre-diabetic, yet they still have giant glucose spikes when exposed to glycemic carbs. That would be someone who's like me. My A1C actually does sit in the pre-diabetic range. I think that's entirely because I'm just so dang sensitive that whenever I expose myself, and over the past couple of years, I've been doing a ton of glucose experiments and setting my glucose super high. It's basically causing a ton of glycation that lingers. So we have up to 70% of US adults that are regularly experiencing hyperglycemia every single day. Well, if LDL gets damaged by hyperglycemia, glycation, oxidation, then of course it's going to associate with heart disease. It's getting damaged in everybody. But it's also why we see, and there's these people out there who think like the lower you get LDL, you're going to make cardiovascular disease an orphan disease. That's frankly idiotic. As long as diabetes exists, you're going to have heart disease. Full stop. I don't care how low you get your LDL,
Yeah.
because you're going to be causing all kinds of endothelial damage or damage to the inside of your blood vessels
Thank you.
from the high glucose, and you're going to be damaging your LDL particles. I see patients all the time that are on statins that have normal LDL levels that are still getting strokes and heart attacks because their glucose is not under control.
What is it
Yeah,
you
and
say?
that's really the, takeaway message here to people, right? And of course, it's one that we've talked a lot about, that controlling your cholesterol, whether we think it's helpful or not, and, again, there's debate on that, but it's clearly not enough, because that approach hasn't been working for even though it's been our focus for the past 50 years plus. Heart disease is not getting better ultimately. And what Darius sees and what I see on a daily basis is people with well-controlled cholesterol that are still coming in with heart disease and, stroke and other cardiovascular diseases. And until we address the blood sugar, the insulin resistance that leads to the higher blood sugar, and of course the food that they're eating that's leading to the high blood sugar, we're not going to really be able to make the headway against this. So maybe let's pivot a little bit, talk about, your life as in the ER, right? And now you're seeing these patients and now you understand this. And, the ER is a challenging environment. You're obviously just seeing these patients for short periods of time. But, how do you then address that with that patient that's coming in, and it's their fourth time they're there in the past 2 months, with their high blood sugar or some effect of that? How do you start to address this now with the patients?
It's interesting. So I have, my bias obviously is that I get the sickest of the sick patients. That's who I see all the time. And unfortunately, I don't get to do any follow up, right? So it's like I have this kind of short window of time to talk to this patient if it's a situation that I feel like I can help. And I have a fair amount of respect around the ER in terms of like a lot of the doctors and nurses and stuff. Everybody knows that I'm really into health and fitness and nutrition. Sometimes they'll actually send me in to talk to a patient about this stuff. And it's actually, I really consider it a blessing. This is actually really why I don't do so much social media stuff, because I like my job. I love my job. I get to take somebody who is having an acute problem and for example, like a non-healing foot wound, for example. That's actually a great example, because I can take a patient like that and go look in their chart and go, wow, I'm looking back in your chart here and I can see that your A1C was 14 just recently. And I can see over the years that your glucose has gotten worse and worse and worse. What are you eating? And in some cases, I find out that people are, say, drinking a couple of liters of Coke a day. And I have, obviously I have to, I got to be very careful about what I say here in terms of HIPAA. So I can't, talk about specific cases, but I have had patients that came back for other reasons and talked to me and said, hey, you helped me heal a foot wound that I had because I didn't realize I was doing this to my glucose. And they were able to, change their diet up. So I can give them certain tips like, hey, if you're drinking soda, knock the soda off, at least switch to like Coke Zero or something. I'm not very bullish on sweeteners, especially for patients who are diabetic and they are addicted to sweets. It really becomes about harm reduction for those patients. I'm like, okay, if you're drinking soda every day, there's no way that I am in 5 minutes going to convince you to just start drinking water. Hey, switch to Coke Zero or diet. Anything else that doesn't raise your blood sugar super high. I've had, for example, the example I gave earlier with the continuous glucose monitors that people are starting to show up with. I can teach them, hey, look, I can tell you all the things that you should and shouldn't be eating, but this device right here is going to tell you the truth. You eat something and you watch it. If your glucose shoots up, you avoid that food or you minimize the heck out of it. I've had a lot of patients who, even on their own, kind of saw me and go, "Hey, you look like you're fit. Can you help me out? I've been getting fatter and sicker over the years. What can I do to reverse this?" In that moment that somebody's actually experiencing an acute cardiac problem or something related to their hypertension or their diabetes or their obesity, I'm able to counsel those patients and point them to some resources. I can point them to Phil. I can point them to Diet Doctor. I can point them to all kinds of different resources. I don't specifically say that everyone should do keto or low carb, but I am on very, very safe ground to tell all these people, hey, don't eat anything that spikes the heck out of your glucose. I really think that at those moments, these patients are much more receptive to this information because they can now see the ultimate result of their lifestyle habits. It's very hard to, and I think everybody's done this with their own families, where they see they're eating a junk diet and they obviously don't look particularly healthy. They're overweight. You can tell they have low energy, and you try, hey, you can feel so much better if you just started eating this way. You started just moving a little bit, and you just cannot get people to change. I had a teacher, this is kind of an aside, but I had a teacher one time that you would always it was my eighth grade science teacher. He'd always put a quote on the board. And one day he puts this quote on the board that says, never underestimate the ability to change yourself. That's very kind of vanilla. I think we all kind of understand that and agree with it. But the next day, I only remember that one because the next day he put on the board, never overestimate your ability to change others. And that one stuck with me because even with these patients that I see that are very sick, in some cases, just they're heading down the path of an early death. I can't change everybody, and I can't make everybody realize that they have a different path ahead of them. But there are those that are receptive, and I try to be very attuned to those who are, because I do think in that moment, I have the ability to affect that person's life in a positive way. And I have seen the results. And again, I've had a handful of patients come back for other unrelated reasons and found me and like, hey, you helped me out. And that's really, really rewarding. I've actually recently we've had several patients come in their 30s and 40s with cardiac events. And I'm actually thinking about putting together like a case series. And since I can work within the hospital system, actually have access to patients and gather some of their data. Because the things that I see over and over again, especially the metabolic syndrome criteria. I see that over and over and over again. In particular, the low HDL, high triglycerides. That is almost ubiquitous.
Yep.
Like that one, more than LDL, because I see LDL, it might be moderately high, maybe it'll be like the mid 100s, mid to upper 100s at worst. Very, very rarely do I see anything over 200, even in the sickest of patients. But that low HDL, high triglyceride, I see that over and over again. And I would love to do this case series because we could identify these people. And every one of these people, I look at their history, have the chance to go back in the chart. At most, they've had like an EKG or a stress test. None of them have had cardiac imaging. None of them have even been diagnosed with metabolic syndrome, even though it's clear in their chart that they have it. And I'm like, well, if this condition is so highly associated with heart disease, why aren't we identifying it in these patients? And why aren't we intervening earlier, at least with diagnostic imaging of some sort? But again, at best, I see stress tests on these patients, which is like, basically waving your hand over a crystal ball in terms of how effective it is identifying people with, with future heart conditions. Like if you're at the point of having EKG changes on a treadmill, you are way far down that path.
Yeah. It's amazing to think about, CGMs, right? They cost nothing essentially, right? They're $50 each retail. If a hospital wanted to buy, 10,000 of these, right? They'd probably get them for $10 a pop or something, right? These patients come into the ER, right? And each time they come into the ER, it's costing thousands and thousands of dollars, let alone even if they don't get admitted. Could you imagine if we just, on the way out of the door of the ER, you got a $10 CGM slapped on your arm and, you get the app and it's just like simple direction. Like if you eat something or drink something and your blood sugar goes above this level, don't eat that or drink that anymore. And what, a powerful impact that would have on people's behavior. And yet it's not even considered, unfortunately, as we see all the time.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of any sort of dynamic measurement, what you're eating in that moment and what it does to you, because it really does have so much more of an impact when you could see it happen in real time. I do want to pivot a little bit though to my own health here. And part of the talk that I had was actually about my own heart disease.
Oh, geez.
Now, yeah, this is the thing. I'm very fit and active and healthy and lean. Nobody would look at me and think heart disease. But I did get at a few years back, actually in summer of 23, I got a coronary artery calcium scan and it came back at 44, which for my age was actually puts me in the pretty high percentile. Like I shouldn't have any calcium at my age, but I do. And this is where there are a lot of people in the low carb space that will be like, LDL doesn't matter at all. LDL isn't an issue. Don't be concerned about it. I completely disagree with that. I think it's contextual. And in my case, my LDL has always been high. The lowest reading I ever had was 179. And that was when I was 24. That's already in like the 95th percentile or something, I think, for LDL. And then when I went low carb, it went even higher. Now it's typically in the low 300s. Since I know for a fact that I tend to be, and it's more of a genetic thing, and I've dug into this a bit. I'll leave the mechanistics behind. And I'll just say genetically, I'm very prone to hyperglycemia. I think that my heart disease comes from the fact that I have had these very high glucose spikes combined with high LDL over the years. Now, my heart disease, I've checked it a couple of times. I've actually had a coronary CT angiogram, which actually they inject contrast and they can see soft plaque in there. And I do indeed have soft plaque. I don't have any what's called low attenuation plaque or low density plaque. That's the stuff that's really, really highly likely to rupture. So I don't have any of that. But I do have mixed soft and calcified plaque. Completely asymptomatic, mind you. I do, Spartan races and decafit challenges and marathons and half marathons. I work out very frequently. I don't have any chest pain or anything like that. Which is, I think it's a big signal that a lot of people should pay attention to, obviously. But I've done a couple of carotid intima media thickness ultrasounds, and in both
I have
both
no
cases,
idea what that is, but
it's an ultrasound of your carotid arteries that go, from your heart to your brain, and you can see plaque or thickening of those arteries, which means there's atherosclerosis happening. It's like a proxy for coronary artery disease, basically. And I've had a couple of those tests, and I had some regression over about a year and a half of my carotid intima media thickness. And in my coronary CT angio, I had it was a tiny bit of progression, but it's basically within the margin of error, like well within the margin of error. So it really was essentially just the same reading. I think people who are completely dismissive of LDL are wrong. But I think on the flip side, people who are the people who want to drive your LDL down to zero are also wrong. Especially if they're doing that at the exclusion of other factors that are in play. What's the guy's name? Simon, one of the low kind of plant-based influencers. He
Um,
had a,
you're talking
look his
about.
name up real quick. I'm familiar with
Simon
him.
Hill or
Simon Hill, that's right.
yeah.
He had a coronary CT angio also, and his LDL is in the 70s. He's plant-based, he is low fat, yet he actually had basically the same amount of plaque that I do. And his plan is basically to drive LDL down even more. And instead of, I mean, it sounds like he's doing that at the exclusion of looking at anything else. Like, hey, are you checking your glucose? Are you checking other factors? Are there inflammatory issues? Are there oxidative stress issues? Are you having some sort of autoimmune problem? He kind of just leaves it up to, he kind of throws out genetics. Like I guess his dad and his grandpa had heart attacks in their 40s. And genetics obviously plays a factor, but genetics are what cause the mechanisms that produce the issues, right? And I think those mechanisms need to be addressed. In my case, my genetics aren't good in terms of glucose metabolism. So the glucose for me, my glucose metabolism and hyperglycemia are a result of my genetics, but the mechanism is still there, and I'm able to control that mechanism now because I have the information.
What do you think the role might be of your athletic activities, right? So we do have some data that points to high level athletic pursuits, endurance type activities seem to correlate with higher than expected rates of heart disease in those people, right? Because otherwise those people you wouldn't think get heart disease. They're healthy and lean and all of that. In a story like yours, right, where you're showing some plaque at an earlier age, and that's raising some concern. And you mentioned, yes, you have this high LDL, but yes, you've also demonstrated in the past that you were having high blood sugars. Maybe you didn't know about it at times. And then, one of the situations where people sometimes see their blood sugar spiking up, we talked about after you eat food, right? But there are other people that they exercise and their blood sugar goes up. And, do you think that that is potentially harmful in that same sort of context?
Yes, potentially. So for myself, I'm not training like a lot of these guys who are out there, just really, really training at high intensities. And that's where we tend to see the higher calcium levels, particular, are these guys that have, that are just really burning the candle at both ends in terms of their training volume and their training intensity, especially. So when they look at studies for people who are athletes, they see that it's the training intensity in specific that tends to associate with the higher coronary artery calcium levels. So for me, do I do some high intensity training? Yes, here and there for sure, but it's usually pretty limited. Most of the time I'm doing kind of zone two running or like on an air bike or doing some lifting sessions or maybe some calisthenics. And occasionally I'll do some 30-minute, 1 hour high intensity sessions, once a week or something like that. So I'm not training at the intensity and volume level to where I think that's actually a problem for me. But you are right that when you are putting out high intensity and high intensity effort, and I'm going to show you this here. So this is what's called a DecaFit challenge. It's actually the shirt I'm wearing right now, and it's basically an event where you run for a few miles. Or it's a 5K plus a station. So it's like you run 500 meters, do a station, 500 meters, do a station. And so you can see during the event, my heart rate is like I averaged at 179 for the whole whatever 45 minutes
Yeah.
for this event. So I'm cooking pretty hard. And you can see right here what my glucose did. It shot up to 179. Actually, I think maybe even a little bit, maybe about 180
Yeah.
during that event. I did not eat. That was me fasted. So that is purely from the glycogen dump during that effort. So now, is that the same as drinking a soda and having my glucose shoot up? I don't know. I can't say whether or not that is those are equal. When you exercise, you do
Oh,
increase
real
your
quick, we just need to point out for our listeners who are not looking at it he's got, was that a CGM that was reporting that?
Yeah,
Okay, he's got
that
a
was a
continuous glucose monitor, and during his exercise, completely fasted, his glucose shot up to 179.
Now, what's
Hours.
concerning, what's concerning about this, Darius, right, is this is what happens to your glucose, right? You were fasted. I'm guessing you were kind of on your usual lowish carb diet at the time, right?
yes.
What many athletes are doing during these events, right, is they're literally mainlining glucose, right? They're using the gel, the goo, whatever it is, right, to keep their energy up with sugar. And, you just wonder what some of their CGMs might look like during something like this.
Yeah, I'm really curious. I haven't seen much data on that. This is a pretty short event, so this isn't something that people would normally fuel during. But, during like a half marathon or a marathon, you definitely see people pounding down gels and carb
Yeah,
loading prior to the event and things like
yeah.
that. Um,
Yeah.
Now, is this as bad as drinking soda? I don't know because when you exercise, you do increase your antioxidative capacity. Your glutathione goes up. So is it the same? I don't know. I have done a ton of different experiments though with high intensity training and fasted versus fed. And if I feed, like, say, if I do something like what's called a keto brick, which is 1,000 calorie bar. Shout out to Rob Sykes, by the way. It's 1,000 calorie bar that is mostly like just fat. I think 80% of the calories from it are fat. If I have one of those like a couple of hours before a high intensity workout, it completely flattens my glucose spike. I don't get the giant glycogen release. I think primarily just because when you eat something like that, you have a ton of energetic substrate as fat floating around your system to utilize. So your body doesn't go, well, I need all this glycogen right now. It just goes, oh, well, there's all kinds of stuff floating around here. I'll just use
So,
that.
so what's your experience with the 1,000 calories worth of fat in your system doing these kind of workout rather than doing it fasted? How's it feel? Does it feel any different?
It's hard to say. I mean, because how your workout feels could be your mood, the weather, how you slept.
I
The
realize it's all subjective, but
Yes. So in general, I feel pretty good when I have one of those a couple hours before. If I eat it too close, though, then I start getting the GI issues and I don't feel as good.
right.
So that's really, as long as it's timed right, I think I generally feel better and more energetic as long as it's far enough out from the actual event. Interestingly, I've actually recently and Phil, you'll like this. I called it a keto or a fat bomb experiment where I consumed two of these keto bricks at one time and I measured labs just before and then at 30 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and 4 hours and watch what my lipids did over that time. And this might be too nerdy for this podcast, but
No, 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 no. We get super nerdy. I'm just the one who goes, I have no idea what that means. So, but so far I'm hanging with you.
okay, well, I mean, maybe I'll go ahead and share it at least
Yeah.
for some of the nerds that really want to take a look at this. So again, I ate one of these things right here. This is a keto brick, mostly cocoa butter.
1,000 calories.
Yep, 1,000 calories. So I ate two of these at one time.
I
So yeah,
Which is impressive enough in and of itself,
was
I'll
going to
say.
say, yeah, that's more.
I struggled to get a whole keto brick down at one setting. These are
yes, they are.
dense, yeah, but awesome.
So that's 112 grams of saturated fat. That's what 176 grams of total fat. It's pretty heavy.
Yeah.
And so I ate one of those and I was like, okay, well, what's my glucose and fat and lipids and stuff do? Now I've done tons of experiments like this all the time, mainly with glucose in my CGM. For example, this is a experiment that I did with orange juice. This is completely fresh squeezed orange juice off. I picked the oranges off of a friend's tree, as organic as you can get, squeeze the orange juice myself, and I saw my glucose do this up to 210 and verified with my finger stick. So I like these really dynamic things. I repeated that In-N-Out burger experiment where I
Yeah.
had the soda and the burger and the fries. This is what I saw. Incredibly high glucose. I love these dynamic experiments. Now, the fat is different. Oh, one more I'll share real quick because this one's very very entertaining. I had a bowl of plain shredded wheat, no added sugar, and I saw my glucose hit 227.
Wait, you ate a bowl of shredded wheat?
I ate a bowl. I mean, it was with non-fat milk, by the way.
The sacrifice Darius makes for science. That there, folks, is your heart healthy shredded wheat.
It was painful.
I'll bet.
But yeah, that's what happened to me. It was a giant glucose spike, no sugar, just non-fat milk and plain shredded wheat. That's the heart healthy, you know, lots of fiber,
Yeah.
you know, even just a single, this is an interesting experiment, single banana, empty stomach. I went from 108 to 179. And that was just, 30 minutes later.
So listeners, he's showing us screenshots of his glucose monitor. One banana on an empty stomach took you in less than 30 minutes.
25 minutes to shoot up to 179.
Mm-hmm. Now, again, this is me. This is my own biology.
Right.
Other people don't necessarily have this. Part of my talk actually was that another buddy of mine eats junk. And I mean pizza and McDonald's hamburgers and French fries and polishes it off with 3 pints of great value ice cream. And his glucose barely budges. It gets into maybe 120s, maybe 130s. His biology.
Let's see what happened with the keto bricks.
Yeah. With the keto brick, glucose was completely flat right here. So obviously that's the case because it doesn't have many carbs in it. I did see ketones go up during the experiment, starting out here, 0.6. My ketones are always actually pretty low. They don't ever go all that high. I won't go into that much here, but in general, people who are, especially lean mass hyperresponders who are lean, often don't see very high ketones. My glucose kind of went up a little tiny bit, but ketones did go up during that whole experiment. But here's a more interesting thing. Now, here are my lipids. If anyone's watching this on a phone, it's going to be hard to see, but on a computer, you should be able to see it somewhat.
I'm also going to change it so that, there we go. All right, okay. So describe what we're looking at here.
So these are the labs that I did during this quote unquote fat bomb experiment that I did where I had these 2 keto bricks. On the first set of labs here, can you see my arrow?
Yep. Okay. January 2nd, 2026.
Yep. That was just kind of a comparison. So this is what my labs kind of tend to look like. My insulin's a little bit higher than it tends to be. I think I was eating a little extra at that time. But my LPIR score is 0. My what's called the NMR lipid profile, NMR lipo profile. It's a proprietary test that LabCorp actually does. And I use Own Your Labs to order this stuff. So shout out to Own Your Labs and Dave and Shaban. Here are my lipids. You can see my total cholesterol is very high at 428, LDL-C 323. But you see my triglyceride to HDL ratio is actually very good. It's well under 1, 0.56, HDL-C 101, triglycerides 57. And this is an important measure right here. VLDL is really important. A lot of people don't realize, but in general, you want that under 10. Going down the column here, you'll see insulin 7.1, a little higher than typically for me. Glucose is 98. My glucose tends to hang out in the mid to high 90s all the time. Home IR 1.7, A1C. Now, here's the thing about me. My A1C is always in the pre-diabetic range. It has never once been lower than that. I think actually one time I had 5.5, but it never gets down to the low 5s.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah. There's a lot of questions as to why that is, because when I do control my glucose well, it still stays there. So some people say it's longer red blood cell lifespan. I'm not sure I entirely buy that, but in any case, that is what my A1C sits at. Uric acid is always low for me. Fructosamine is in a normal level.
Okay,
this is what's called.
Comment on this. If this was your patient, you're looking at it, what are you seeing?
Yeah, so when I look at his baseline here in January, right, he's got very low triglycerides, high HDL cholesterol. He's very insulin sensitive by all of these different measures. And, he's got good sizes of his cholesterol particles, his LDL particles specifically. One of the numbers we look at there are the small LDL particles. These are like the most damaging form of LDL, and they're below the lowest limit of detection on this test. So, he's got a very healthy looking profile here. The A1C being high is a little interesting. Insulin, maybe a little higher than some people would say ideal, and low inflammation is the other thing that I notice here. He's got an HSCRP of 0.15, so very low. And then he eats the keto bricks. And so the morning of the keto bricks, right, 7:30 there, you're similar numbers. Yep.
This is actually an interesting point I do want to make.
Yeah, I was looking at that. So now we're looking at the day he ate the keto bricks.
Yes. So at 7:38,
a couple of months after taking his baseline year.
Yep. So actually, this column at 7:38 was prior to the keto break. This was the initial lab test, and this is I want to point out a very, very interesting thing here for Phil, especially. So you see my small LDLP, 10.86. That's the highest I've ever seen it. I do notice I do sometimes get little bumps in small LDLP, and it's almost always during active fat loss. Mm-hmm. So at this time, I was in a bit of a deficit. I don't think I intended to be, but I ended up being so for sure. And I do see, usually I'll see my triglycerides go up as well. In this case, not so much, but I will see a bump in small LDLP. In this case, it was actually pretty dang high. Ultimately, it didn't affect my LPIR score. It was still pretty low. So I was still, again, insulin sensitive. But just continuing on that track there, as the hours went on, you can see my small LDLP dropped a huge amount.
1086 at 7:38 in the morning. At 10 o'clock in the morning, it's dropped to 6:30. And a little less than 2 hours after that, before noon. So in less than 4.5 hours, it's back down below the measurable level.
Exactly. So this is a very, very interesting thing. I was talking to Dave Feldman about this as well. This is one of the numbers.
For context, the small LDLP that's the really dangerous situation.
Theoretically, yes.
Those are the form of LDL particles that are most what we call atherogenic. They are the most likely to be involved in plaque formation, is how I usually explain this to people. And it's fascinating to see, right? First of all, it's just fascinating to see between your January 2nd and your, February 27th, right? That dramatic a change. And then within 4 hours after eating keto bricks, right, to see them plummet like that. And this probably has to do with, so during this 4 hours, right, your body is trying to process all of this fat that you just ate. And so it doesn't surprise me to see your triglycerides go up, right, because that's how your body's going to kind of, initially transport that fat. And, what is interesting, right? So your LDL comes down, your HDL comes down a little bit, but your LDL went from 315 down to 258, that says. So,
dropped. And I had my LDLP went down as well.
Yeah. And your LDLP went down and the small particles dropped dramatically, right? So what does that tell us? You were basically pumping out more large particles, and all of those small particles that had been floating around in your blood basically got reabsorbed into your liver real quick, because you're trying to recycle your LDL particles to now transport this fat around and the triglycerides, and the LDL. But it's pretty interesting. And then your insulin, goes up a decent amount, went from 6.3 to 18.4, but your blood sugar doesn't change, right? So like you said, I mean, keto bricks are fairly low carb, but they're not zero carb. And so your body was kind of dealing with that carbohydrate load. And, at least temporarily, you were becoming more insulin resistant. The LPIR goes up and the HOMA-IR calculation goes up. Very fascinating experiment, I'll say.
So, I do want to point out a couple things here. Something that I've seen a lot in the LMHR Facebook group is that a lot of people will see their small LDLP go up during active fat loss. I'm not entirely sure what mechanistically is happening here, but one thing that we do know for sure is when your insulin goes up, it does shut down lipolysis, right? So in this case, this actually makes sense if that my small LDLP, if my small LDLP is elevated because I was actively losing fat weight, it does make sense that it drops down to fat practically nothing when my insulin goes up acutely because I'm not actually seeing any lipolysis happening. So I don't know. I'm going to need D'Agostino to somebody to explain this mechanistically to me, but I think it was super fascinating to see. And again, this was the highest small LDLP I've ever seen. It's almost always well under 90 because I'm usually weight stable. I do want to point out, so something that a lot of people will say, and even Ben Bickman will say this, saturated fat does cause a little bit of insulin resistance. So when you look at my insulin, it goes up. It's never hyperinsulinemic, right? I'm not even going over 20, barely over 20 microIUs per milliliter. But like it does stay elevated for quite a long time because there's just so much energetic substrate and my body has something to do something with it. And insulin is how it's, managing all that excess substrate floating around. Unfortunately, what most people are doing is they're not eating exclusively saturated fat or exclusively carbohydrates. And when you eat like exclusively carbohydrates, I'll show you this really quick. I did another experiment where I did what's called a craft test, and I consumed glucose beverage and checked my insulin and glucose levels over the couple hours. You can see my glucose. I tried it on both a 1 week of a strict ketogenic diet and 1 week of a high carb diet to see what the difference was. And at the end of the keto week, I had a higher glucose spike and a higher insulin spike because the higher your glucose goes, the more insulin you're kicking out to deal with it. Now, compare this, look at insulin peak here for my keto week. Looks like it's somewhere around 90, maybe high 80s. Compare that with the keto brick, which was 2,000 calories, but barely any carbs. Insulin barely touched 20. But when I consumed pure glucose as a beverage, which actually is only like, I think 400 calories, I'm getting a much higher insulin spike. Now think about it. Most people are eating a McDonald's meal, right? So when I ate that, or the In-N-Out meal, that's a good example. When I ate that meal, which has a lot of fat and carbs in it, I'm getting a giant glucose and insulin spike. And any fat in that meal is keeping my insulin elevated for a long time. That's where we get people who end up chronically hyperinsulinemic because they never let their insulin come back down after consuming a meal like that. They end up going on and eating something else or eating some snack in between. And so the glucose and the insulin are constantly staying high.
Yeah, that combination of, right. And this is a lot of why we thought saturated fat was so bad for our health, was because most of the time people in those studies were not eating isolated saturated fat. They were eating saturated fat combined with carbohydrates. And, clearly, I don't think you would find anyone, no matter what nutritional camp they're in, that would disagree that the combination of saturated fat and refined carbohydrates is probably the worst thing that we can eat. And that's the standard American diet, essentially.
Yeah, it truly is. Again, like I was saying, that type of meal, burgers, fries, and a soda is ubiquitous in America.
Yeah.
Last thing here, I checked inflammation markers during this experiment as well with the keto brick experiment. HSCRP stayed flat, didn't budge. Actually, I think I forgot to put the last two in here, but it was the same. I checked what's called LPPLA2 activity, which is showing inflammation in the arteries. And in this case, if anything, it dropped or basically within the margin of error. But I did see what's called the sedimentation rate, erythrocyte sedimentation rate go up a couple hours into the experiment. So I thought that was pretty interesting. I don't know if you can see that, Phil. Um,
Yeah.
eating is an inflammatory action, right? I checked, renal labs all say the same, liver enzymes. Interestingly, they were all completely the same except for the bilirubin dropped to like unreadable, undetectable levels, which I thought was interesting. Free fatty acids did go up. They roughly doubled. And I thought this was a fascinating bit too. My testosterone dropped by quite a bit. Went from 704 to 452. Not really sure, again, mechanistically what's going on there. It could just be, I don't know, in such a fed state, my body's like, hey, you need to just chill out. What else about this can I say? Oh, one last bit. Whenever anybody says to like, you only need to check LP little a once in your life, I think it's ridiculous. You can see right here on these two readings up towards the top here, I had a 20-point difference in my readings there. It does go up and down depending on what you're doing. I've had to go up to like the 150s after a trip where I was like consuming all of the carbs and seeing gigantic glucose spikes. I've seen it drop down into the 60s when I was super, super, super strict. That is a measure that I think people should get checked more often. Doesn't necessarily need to be, every few months, but, once a year or so. What else?
Awesome
Oh,
experiments that you've been doing. Like I said, I think you're bringing a lot of interesting data. You're raising a lot of interesting questions within the community, and really glad that we were able to get you on and be talking about this. Where does this kind of lead to you? For you, where do you see kind of in the future as to what you might be able to do around all of this?
I always struggle with that question myself because I do value my personal time, just hanging out with my wife and I have an 8-month-old daughter. Those take a lot of my time and a full-time job and a dog that needs attention too, and a house that has stuff that always needs to get done. You know, I struggle with deciding if I want to do more YouTube videos or more podcasts or anything like that because those are just also time consuming. Ultimately, I like to just kind of dabble in this space, talk to people like you who are extremely knowledgeable, learn what I can, and apply what I've learned to my own practice with the patients that I see in the ER because I feel like I can actually on the ground help real people that I see in front of me that are suffering.
Yeah.
And being able to do that is pays way more dividends than just being able to, pop off a couple of videos on YouTube. And ultimately, I try to gather the information so that I can then help other people in real time in my real life. And, maybe again, like I was thinking, I want to do some more stuff in and around the medical system that I already work for. Maybe I can, get them to eliminate juice in the hospital, for example, which I can't tell you how many times my diabetic patients have 5 boxes of juices next to them when I walk into
Yeah.
their room. Or just to get them to, start doing more earlier diagnostic imaging for cardiovascular disease. So I think I want to affect the areas that I'm closer to rather than, do a whole bunch of stuff in the nutritional metabolic health space. That's why, again, I've kept a low profile this whole time.
Yeah, but I love what you brought here. This was really, really cool. And I love the subtlety and the nuance and the context, the lack of black and white proclamations that all of this is always bad and all of this is always good. It's good to look at real life experiments. I am utterly fascinated that there's a human being who actually ate a bowl of shredded wheat and didn't end up in the emergency room by himself. And likewise, the same human being ate two keto bricks. That ought to put you in the record books all by
I've heard of
itself.
people eating 4 of those. So
Good Lord. All right. Darius, thanks for joining us. I'll let folks know that you've got an Instagram account, which I guess is probably the most active thing available for you. But But really, your job here, I think, is to just demonstrate how to be a citizen scientist and how to take responsibility for your own health.
That's a huge part of it. So many people I see, and especially all my patients, they just kind of float through life and don't even think about the things that they're doing to their bodies. They're not, I've always been kind of a nerd about it. I've always read ingredient labels. At least, the very least, I started doing that from the moment I first started shopping for myself. But most people don't even think about the things that they're putting into their mouth. They go, "Oh, this tastes good. I'm going to eat it." I always say that in this space, we're always talking about keto versus vegan versus carnivore versus plant-based versus high fat, low carb, high carb, low fat. The vast, vast, vast majority of people are not trying to decide between, those diets. They're trying to decide between McDonald's versus KFC versus Pizza Hut.
Yep.
And that's the people I want to reach. Those are the people I'm trying to reach. Those are the patients that I see that have never once even considered the fact that the things that they are eating are contributing to their poor health. And my whole goal is to make them see that. And so that they can then do something about it.
Yep. That's good.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Be the
guys.
change you want to see.
Something like that.
That's good. Well, our guest today has been Darius Sharpe, who is an ER nurse and a citizen scientist who does his own biohacking. Share this episode with the folks in your life who need to hear it, and you'll know who you are and who they are. And I'll make sure that we post Darius's contact info in the show notes. It's Merce_Darius. Is that right?
Yeah.
Merce with M as in Mary.
As in man nurse.
As in, that I was trying to figure out why was it an M? Okay. A Merce. All right. Merce_Darius at Instagram. Well, for Dr. Philip Ovadia, I'm Jack Heald. This has been Stay Off My Operating Table. We're glad you're here. Come back and see us next time. We'll talk to y'all soon.
Chances are you wouldn't be listening to this podcast if you didn't need to change your life and get healthier. So take action right now. Book a call with Dr. Ovadia's team. One small step in the right direction is all it takes to get started. Contact us at ifixhearts.com/talk. That's ifixhearts.com/talk.